All right. Hello, welcome. Welcome to the last session of the day before lunch and before you get out of here. So hopefully we'll keep it a little bit relevant for you. My name is Greg Truty. I work for IBM. I am responsible for our mobility platform that we actually offer for IBM, not just WorkLight, but pretty much all we're actually doing across our mobile capabilities from an IBM perspective. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about, now that you've built the app, how do we actually keep it relevant? From an enterprise perspective, how should they think about building apps? What do the successful companies that are actually building apps actually do? And what's scattered in here are effectively anecdotes and feedback that we're actually getting as we work with customers on building apps, both from our services organization, through our software group products that we actually provide available, working with customers, our own apps that we actually have internally. There's a bunch of collateral that we actually have, and I'll kind of share where we see enterprises going as they try to bring mobility into their enterprise itself, the challenges that they actually have, and from a portfolio perspective, what we're trying to do to actually help based off of what we hear from customers and what we actually see working with customers and how it affects our products. It's meant not to be a sales pitch. In fact, there's nothing really product specific in here. But I am alluding to a little bit of our point of view based off of what we're actually hearing and working from a customer perspective. Now, from an enterprise mobility perspective, there's a couple approaches that we see most enterprises actually going through in how they actually build apps. And really the question that enterprises should be asking themselves is, in order to be successful with leveraging mobility and the apps that you guys provide to do the things that you want to do, what can the rest of the company do in order to actually support the usage of the apps and take advantage of the apps within the enterprise? There's three approaches that we see companies doing in general if we were to boil it down, and a lot of it boils down to a maturity model. The first approach is really the part of the company that basically treats the app like a microscope, right? It's a really focused sort of thing. Typically, it's a line of business, gets an idea. They actually figure out that they actually want to go out, treat mobile, which is important for them to actually do something business-wise. So they actually contract out, in many cases, with a third-party provider. They build the app, they deploy the app, and they think they're successful at that point perspective. They're now on the mobile roadmap. Right, and we actually have a number of companies that actually go down this path. From that perspective, one that I'm actually thinking in particular here, it's a U.S. healthcare company. They actually did this. Once they actually got the app in the App Store, the first problem that they actually ran into is they got a number of customer requirements, customer feedbacks against that sort of thing. And they were not really prepared to actually bring it back in-house. They couldn't bring it back in-house. They didn't develop the app. They didn't actually build the skills in order to actually develop the app. Every update costed them money in order to actually update the app. So this is one of the approaches that most companies that are really just starting to get into mobility are actually going through. The next approach is companies that realize that they want to do things with mobility. They start with basically saying, okay, I'm going to pick up a toolkit. It's going to actually help me accelerate building the app itself. And that's certainly one approach. That's a better approach. They're starting to build skill within the enterprise itself. They're trying to reuse some of that skill across apps. They recognize that they don't want to just do one app, but they want to actually probably do multiple apps. They want to build up skill from that perspective. Again, great model from that perspective. But it's a developer-focused approach. It's an approach that you guys being developers, can probably get your heads around because that gives you things that you can actually control. But there's a whole set of requirements that need to be considered as part of doing that as the apps actually get rolled out from that perspective. One is it has to be integrated into the set of the enterprise, right? So many times these toolkits only do client-side only sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily actually help with the back-end enterprise integration itself. The toolkits in many cases actually help build the app itself. It doesn't necessarily actually help manage the application and bring it into the model. The third approach is really focusing more on the lifecycle aspect of it, right? So it's not just about the app. It's not just about the toolkit. It's really about thinking the app from a holistic perspective. Similar to the rest of how software is developed within the enterprise, there's a whole lifecycle around this app. And in order to actually get mobility accepted within an enterprise itself, it's really trying to get the enterprise to get their heads around developing the strategy around how to deal with the entire mobile lifecycle, about developing the app, delivering the app, testing the app, releasing the app, et cetera. From an IBM perspective, this is kind of the approach that we actually have from our mobile-first perspective, right? It tries to get customers to think about the whole life cycle because there's unique aspects around all of the mobility life cycle as part of that. Whether it's working with wireframe designers in order to actually try to imagine the experience and then quickly turn that into a set of working code, right? We're finding interesting differences in how they actually go prototype those applications. Many cases, when you prototype a set of wireframes and actually try to implement it, you're basically serving up data locally from that perspective. But as you then start to build it into a working app, you do with things like model view controllers and figuring out how to model your data and how to actually then deal with transitioning the data right from one view to another view. And again, it requires you to think about it from an application building perspective. Instrumenting the app is going to be important in actually to get metadata and understanding about what's actually happening in the app itself, both pre-production and post-production from that perspective. Testing the app, certifying the app. In many cases, just to deliver things within a company guideline, if companies even have guidelines of apps, they're going to actually have to build that collateral up. Most successful companies that are actually doing this are starting to establish center of competencies such that they can actually start to build and define skills for how to actually deal with this. Now, the companies that are doing this successfully are actually building reference architectures. And I stole a set of charts from our services organization within the UK, which actually starts to put together a little bit of some visibility of how companies should be thinking about dealing with mobility within their enterprise itself. Because it's not just about the app, it's really about managing the entire life cycle of things within the app itself. These set of charts, I have 5 charts. They really represent a view of what enterprises need to think about mobility from 2 aspects. One is the user who's actually building the app itself and developing the app. The second is what does that mean to the enterprise? So from a user perspective in the development and test flow, it's all about really enabling the application developer to be productive building the app. Function testing the application, working within an IDE. How do we actually collaborate amongst developers? There's a set of tasks that they actually have to go through in order to actually verify, check for vulnerabilities, just trying to get enterprises to think about this, right? And what are the uniquenesses of mobile is actually pretty key going forward. From an enterprise perspective, this means, right, setting up source code management, doing continuous integration, figuring out how do I actually do continuous integration on mobility. It's not just about continuous integration of building the app, but it's continuous integration of actually the app and all of its subsequent resources that it's going to access in the backend system itself. Going through those deployments, doing the separate build processes, taking it from a development environment to a UAT environment into production, right, are all pieces of infrastructure that companies actually have to start thinking of because, again, if they want to be successful, these are the things, the properties that need to get done in order to actually help successfully build an app. Service virtualization. Service virtualization is important in many cases for enterprises because at the end of the day, many of the resources in which you're actually going to get your data back sit in the backend systems of record. They sit in CICS systems, they sit in SAP systems, they sit perhaps off on the cloud at salesforce.com. And a lot of these systems all take MIPS, processing power, CPU, in order to actually go provide that. So if you start combining it with some of these other thoughts like continuous integration, you start to get into cases where you're going to want to be able to actually kind of cut that off from the backend system because you can't afford to be doing continuous integration testing as part of doing that build. So again, a very important aspect of that. A lot of the new applications that we see being built are actually leveraging new technology out there, things like NoSQL systems. In many of these cases, enterprises aren't really set up to manage and tune these things. So from a development perspective, leveraging cloud-based infrastructure, again, is another sort of interesting pattern that we see developers actually going through. Now that they've built the app, then it's really taken it through production. And there's, again, a set of things that typically the end user has to deal with in order to take it through productions. And being able to, right, once the app is actually out there, manage the device, provision the device, get the app on the device itself. But from an enterprise perspective, lots of things actually have to be set up that the enterprise actually have to do. Many of these enterprise applications that are being built are for the employee itself. But the employee is mobile. The employee is outside the enterprise. So you're going to have to define APIs to access things outside the enterprise itself. For consumer-based applications, many times the apps are actually being revved in multiple forms. There's different versions of the apps on the backend system. So you're going to have to start dealing with application management, API management. As you rev the app, try to leverage a new API as part of that. You're going to have to keep all of these APIs consistently running in production. The load on the backend system from an access management system. Right, there's now more logons actually getting done in the system itself for mobility because it's just simpler and easy to do as part of that. Giving the business an ability to actually view what's actually happening with the mobility devices is going to be key. It's how the business knows that mobility is actually making their employees more productive. So being able to actually surface up some of that metadata is a key enabler as part of that. Flexible infrastructure, again, going back to that NoSQL system. Getting the business and the enterprise comfortable with running some of their infrastructure, not on-premise if they don't have the skills, but on the cloud is a challenge, a task that many enterprises face. Getting comfortable with the end-to-end capabilities that are needed when they actually start delivering mobile throughout the enterprise itself. Content management. Right, many of these apps will have content that are actually going into the apps. Much of the content wants to be changed dynamically. So using content management systems to actually help push data into the app as well as out to the edge from a caching system. Again, this is something that we're starting to see more and more customers do as they start thinking through the development and the life cycle of the application itself. Workflow, giving a lightweight workflow engine, not workflow in the sense of I want to improve a set of employees' tasks, therefore I'm going to actually go through and do a big business process management flow to figure out what they're doing today, how to optimize it to make it performant, but giving the developers the ability to actually work through the workflow of what the end user is doing on the device and actually keeping state management is something key and critical for that. An example of this that I know of a company doing, it's an insurance-based company that does auto loans. They actually had to rethink the workflow from a smartphone device or a tablet device of how to actually walk a customer through a 40-question process in order to actually qualify them for a loan. They rethought the process and they wanted to optimize it for a better user experience so the customer didn't think that they were actually going through and answering 30 questions. But two, as they went along it, with each individual question, they were able to refine the funnel of customers to understand, okay, is it worth me doing some other resource calls in order to actually figure out whether they would actually qualify? Because it costs them to actually go through some of the process. So giving the developers the ability to actually modify this process as they work through the user experience is an example of something that's key and critical from that perspective. Now that said, once you have a reference architecture, that helps. But as we go through and actually build the apps, we're seeing a set of best practices in a variety of different areas, both from designing the apps to building the apps to deploying the apps to managing the apps as they actually go along. So what I've done is I've stolen the best practices that we actually have in a number of different articles, a number of different papers that we actually have within IBM. And I'll throw some customer anecdotes in around some of this. But don't assume anything about user preferences. Instead, validate design trade-offs. This one's actually kind of interesting in that IBM itself has made an initiative to try to actually get back to provide a better experience for our customers. Part of what we're doing is we're actually creating a 2,000-person organization focused nothing on design and rethinking how we actually design our products, design our products, design our experiences. But part of going through that design process is much of what digital design agencies are actually doing with mobile apps as they really rethink about user experience. So doing prototypes, doing implementations, getting feedback from customers are all key in specific about trying to actually be effective from a design perspective. Speed, and the perception of speed. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to go through a couple of them with some examples. Here's a case where we have a Canadian financial company. As they were actually building apps, they were finding out that as they went from their smartphone app to the tablet app, the data queries that they actually had to pull data back on the smartphone app was fine because you're effectively looking at a narrow view of that application itself. But as you actually then expanded that to a tablet-based view, you have more information. They were then trying to correlate some of those views together on a kind of a single pane of glass. And they were finding out that as they were going through that process, they actually had to redesign their APIs because they didn't, or I should say the network couldn't return the data fast enough in order to populate that in a simplified way. So instead, they had to rethink the experience and try to figure out what's the first set of information that needs to be populated. How would I actually populate that? And then in the background, pull back the rest of the data in order to prepare for subsequent views. So while some of this is a user experience perspective, some of it is trying to figure out how do I combine a little bit of what the user experience is actually going to be, and then under the covers, how do I actually map it to an underpinnings from an implementation perspective? Adhering to Security 101, just doing simple stuff like encrypting passwords, not displaying the passwords as they're actually typing it. Again, interesting sorts of things. I always love demos where you could see people actually typing their passwords in for a second, right, each individual character before it goes away. Don't bury the most important functions. Working with mobile applications gives you the ability to actually create fit-for-purpose applications. Many customers that we saw kept trying to cram more and more information into it. And it's really about rethinking the experience from that perspective. Best practices for mobile application development, be results-oriented. The most successful projects that we actually see are those projects which really are focusing on transformative apps. I have some customers that I've talked to that are building, and I kid you not, lunch apps to see what's actually available on your lunch thing in order to actually make their employees productive. Part of why they're doing that is they're just trying to dip their toe in the water. But they're clearly not going to get the funding to really go anywhere further. So it's really about trying to engage with the line of business and actually come up with these transformative apps. There's a financial company in the US that I work with that in their approach, they actually have a laboratory out in Silicon Valley, and it's their job to basically envision what could it possibly be sort of thing. So here's a case where, while they have a center of competency that they're actually building up from a mobile perspective, they're giving a team of developers in a different part of the organization free rein to basically go re-envision what can banking be from that perspective. Pulling in any sorts of new technologies that they want, re-envisioning the experience, right? And just trying to get the line of business to understand what the experience could actually be. Meanwhile, the mainstream production development team that's actually in another location within the US is focused on working on defining the scalable architecture, defining the technologies that they're going to need to support that, and actually working through and defining the best practices. It's very key. It's very important kind of going forward. Test early, test often. Lots of stories related to this that we actually see customers actually going through. There's a retail company that I know that's actually going out right now. They're trying to actually make the Christmas rush, trying to finalize their mobile app as they actually go out the door. They waited until they got through about 6 months of the process before they actually started stress testing the APIs on the back end of the system. They want to get to 25,000 users concurrently logged onto the application itself. They could get to about 1,000 right now. So they weren't even thinking about testing the backend service APIs to see that they could actually even handle the demand and the load on the system itself. Another example is on the test early, test often sort of QA bottleneck perspective, just the number of devices, going out into the field, being able to test it on a different number of devices. A similar US bank that we actually worked with, when they delivered their applications out into the field itself, they ended up having a problem on 5% of the devices. Right, so having 95% coverage, they thought was a pretty good deal, but 5% of a big number, 3 million users is a big number, right? All of that feedback came back into the App Store. That App Store was a reflection on their brand. Again, this is something that many customers, it's a different experience dealing with mobility within enterprises itself. Monitor the app usage for potential issues. Some of this is to look for problems within the app itself. Some of this may be trying to figure out where are users spending their time in the app itself. If they're not spending in your time where you thought you'd want to spend their time, you may want to redesign the app such that the things that they're actually doing are prominent and as easy as possible for them to do as they're actually using the app itself. And then basically trying to move enterprises into an agile delivery model, getting them to actually work with a variety of skills, picking up a lot of new technologies is something that we see enterprises actually struggle with. So varying the skill level really certainly helps from that perspective. From a mobility perspective, and there are architectural choices that are starting to come up. One of the Gartner reps actually talked about mobile isn't really a new kind of development. It's really a new architecture. And it's really about structuring not just the application development, but how applications are actually developed and all of the infrastructure that they're going to actually have going on into the backend system itself. Rethinking that context of where you're going to get the information, being able to visualize the context itself, how to actually compose and get new information for your mobile applications from a variety of different services, and weaving in that logic, weaving in that context is going to be important. Because in order to get that context, you can't just leverage context on the device itself. You may actually have to get historical information about the user, information from the backend system, weave it in with something perhaps that they're actually doing on social media. And that's really how to actually get that rich context in order to actually do this. So setting up the tiers of your architecture to be able to drive that actually is going to be kind of important going forward. One of the things that we're starting to see is SOA was very big 10 years ago. APIs are kind of the new SOA, right? There's APIs coming and gathering data from all sorts of things. I have a meeting in about a week with a car device company, utility company, that's actually building a mobile application in order to actually pull data from the car itself about the speed of the car, the car characteristics of what's actually happening on the car itself, and they're looking to develop a mobile application to allow the driver of the car to be able to make certain decisions based off of how they see the car reacting to how they actually drive. I have another sort of conversation that we've had with customers on insurance companies, again, leveraging some of that same information to offer discounts, right, for safe car drivers based off of what they see actually coming from the car itself. So here's a case where in order to establish something like that, that translates from a technology view, right, into something that really drives business value and can actually make a real difference for a customer, a lot of that requires weaving together data that's actually coming back from one device into a system itself, making calls to another set of APIs from a different set of business, working that and defining that with a new process of the policy and the user of what they actually know in the system record of the insurance company, and then surfacing all that up in the mobile device itself. So being able to stitch together these APIs and figure out authentication model-wise how things actually work is something that we see key going forward. Many enterprises today, as they're rolling out applications, are realizing that the success of their mobile applications are dependent on how well they actually move towards SOA and actually separating out the business logic for their data logic. There's still a lot of back-end legacy systems that are still wrapped up with a lot of business logic in how they do the presentation logic. So just dealing with that has been a struggle for a number of companies. Because of these APIs, the effect of mobile and the APIs into the system is actually another sort of thing that the customers start to think of. One aspect of it, if you think of the data that you view on the device, right, it's coming from a large data set on the backend system. There's a set of queries that certainly are going against it on some sort of mid-tier view to pull some of that information back. That query typically then gets modified in order to actually strip up the data just necessary to the mobile device. It gets passed to the mobile device. There's components, view controllers, et cetera, views that are stripping down that data to allow you to page to the data itself. So it's this funnel of large amounts of data back to this little tiny window that's actually coming on the mobile device. In addition to this, there's the inverse thing. From a device perspective, the device is certainly issuing business requests from an API perspective to the enterprise itself. But in many cases, there's analytic data coming off the device. There's security and authentication access information that's coming off the device that actually has to prompt into the server side a set of resources to allow people to log in. I remember a lot of logouts, or I should say, I remember a lot of conversations with financial companies where they're getting pounded, right, by mobile devices. You make something easy with mobile devices, you make it simple, easy to use, you're going to see more and more of it from them. An example here is, which surprised me a little bit, the peak load for banking applications typically is Friday afternoon. And the reason it's Friday afternoon is many times people get paid and they want to see how much money they have in their bank account before they go out for the weekend. So just being able to deal with the load for mobile applications is something that a lot of enterprises are actually struggling with. Companies are having challenges delivering mobile-driven business value in a continuous fashion. If you look at some of the challenges, some of these things are battery, memory, network test cases. I've seen some companies where they've actually added in geolocation into their application. They thought they were doing great. It was a US tire company that actually built an application such that the mobile application could make it easy for their employees to actually sell mobility solutions to their customers. That same employee actually went across the street to actually go purchase lunch, and they actually had location information that was actually sensing when they moved each time, and it ended up draining his network battery. So it was a case where, from a test perspective, there's a lot of capabilities that are on the mobile devices, and just getting best practices about how to use these things, companies are struggling with it, trying to actually figure out how to deal with those sorts of things. To deliver code changes and set themselves up in a continuous delivery model perspective. Testing is critical. We are finding out that most companies under-test. They don't test enough. They don't test enough on the access into that back-end system of record sort of enterprise perspective. Manual testing to look at interactions that are actually happening on a variety of different devices. You can certainly test in a test cloud. What you can't see in a test cloud in many cases is the transition from one screen to another screen, how long it actually takes. What is that real user experience? Live testing from devices in the field, network connectivity issues, again, device issues. If you're pulling data from the back-end enterprise, it's not just the factor of the amount of data that you want to pipe, it's the latency issues that you're actually going to have, timeouts of back-end systems from that perspective. So all of these things are key critical things that are necessary in order to be successful getting an app out the door. There's an article on our developer work site talking about the best practices for DevOps. These are some of the best practices for DevOps broken up into 3 sections: continuous integration and delivery, testing and monitoring, mobile app delivery. Some issues here is we're starting to see, again, different companies, as they roll out new features to the applications itself, they're getting into new issues managing all of the versions of their backend APIs. They don't actually want to force customers to upgrade from mobile application to mobile application because they don't want to necessarily deter their experience. Therefore, they're having to manage all of the backend infrastructure in order to actually validate and continue to ensure that the APIs that these mobile apps are actually calling are still actually able to work. Let's skip off this. Notifications. Notifications is a great feature on the device itself. There's a set of best practices that come out from our campaign management team for push that are actually defined here. Examples include the following sorts of things to really effectively engage customers or engage employees in leveraging some of the capabilities of push in order to actually get that better experience. Content is king. The example that I'll use here is that they actually have a sports team that actually does push notifications. The sports team leverages push notifications as a way to engage their fans. So that's a great way from a fan base perspective to start building up engagement with a company in order to actually drive some nice, interesting content that they're actually going to be in love with. Likewise, that provides, affords the enterprise the ability to actually send branded content to keep that fan engaged with them, such that they can actually then take it to the next level of driving transactions, driving sales of their collateral, et cetera. Building deeper conversations through cross-channel interactions. We have multiple examples of retail companies where they recognize that you come into the store, you buy something, but because they know that you've registered, they've integrated part of the business process on the back-end system ways to basically then thank you with a push notification for making a purchase or sending a receipt. Again, other ways to help start trying to build an engagement with the customer, providing a better experience for the user themselves. Deploying user preferences. Pretty much, and we see it happening all the time with privacy constraints and et cetera, giving customers the ability to actually control what features that they want and don't want on is going to be key and critical for you maintaining and keeping that relationship with that end user itself, especially if it's a consumer-based app as part of that. Building a mobile app retention plan, right? Trying to understand at what point is too much, right, from a notification perspective, right? If you start doing too many things like over-messaging users, you'll start to see that they won't open the app, they won't respond to the message. They may even remove the app from the system itself. There's capabilities within the underlying push resources, like understanding if the device token is actually not there, et cetera, in order to understand the relationship between your messaging back out to the end user and whether it's actually being effective. So trying to leverage that and take advantage of that is key and critical to really figuring out the best way to actually engage with your customers. So doing mobile right means a lot of change. It means really working in an agile, iterative fashion, right? We all know the life cycles of developing the apps, but it's getting the enterprise to also recognize that this agile, iterative development actually has to take effect, not just on the application development side, but on all the back-end infrastructure side. So setting up your environment to deal with this is actually going to be critical for you to do things right. For those, the next set of charts actually comes from a business value study that we've done as part of our global business services organization. We queried about 300 companies. Out of the 300 companies, 600 companies. Out of the 600 companies, we actually had 30 face-to-face interviews with a lot of the mobility leaders of those companies. And what we were really looking at is trying to figure out what are the characteristics of companies that actually got mobile, that were doing it well with mobile from that perspective, and what are the recommendations that they actually had. And these things are actually split into two groups. One is for companies that haven't quite adopted mobility. Some are for companies that actually have adopted mobility. So as developers, right, as you go back and work with enterprises itself, gauging where your enterprises are or where your customers are working within the enterprise, right? These are all suggestions, recommendations to get them to think about developing a mobile strategy, about being bold, being targeted, being iterative, right? And then again, if they're well aware, it's about then trying to leverage, right, machine-to-machine interaction, sensor-based capabilities, really expand the model from a sensor perspective to move their mind from mobile being about the app to mobile being about the user and leveraging the fact that the user is mobile and leveraging and blending in from that perspective. In order to actually help spur the conversation, we actually have a set of questions that you can use to actually help get your business thinking about, right, developing a mobile strategy. And some of these questions can actually help a customer and an enterprise understand what it's going to take to make mobile successful with them. There's a set of recommendations that we actually have here around improving the customer experience and driving the productivity. Starting small with simple applications themselves, expanding on them to start leveraging some of the features on the device and really getting rich transformative experiences for the things that they actually want to do going forward. This is certainly what we are doing in IBM, working with our customers of where we want to take them as we make mobility strategic for everybody. The last set of questions is really about, and there's a set of questions, again, that you can use to actually help foster and seed the conversation from that perspective. The last set of recommendations are really around enabling the mobile environment. All right, really about, and again, a lot of these things are emphasizing the same points that we said before, right? Tap in the values of APIs, use analytics, not just analytics of what's coming from the app itself, tie it in with your backend system. Do predictive analytics, leverage the demographics that you get about your end users themselves, right? Really try to hone the application that you're actually building to improve their experience, because once you start doing that, you're going to start then seeing mobile take off and the productivity that we see in the consumer space, right, translate itself back into the enterprise itself. So hopefully this gives you a little food for thought. It's kind of certainly what we're hearing from customers. It's what we're finding out that we need to do from a portfolio perspective ourselves to make customers successful. And hopefully from this you've gleaned at least some key insights from an enterprise perspective of some of the challenges that you're going to have, some of the work that you can actually do to become successful working in the enterprises, and some ways perhaps for thinking about how to actually start emphasizing key things that perhaps you aren't doing right now, or ways to actually help drive the enterprise to incorporate mobility into its strategy. Anyway, that said, at this point in time, any questions? All right, lunchtime, huh? All right, thank you.